So when I was asked to do this presentation, I kind of thought, what am I going to call it? And I actually felt that it would be good to think about who has influenced me and how I have been influenced. So I've called it Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And anybody who has ever seen me speak before, if there are a few of you here, it's something that I do talk about quite a lot, about who are the giants. Who are the people of stature in your own experience who help you and who help you to think and who help you to challenge yourself at different points in your career. So I thought I would share some of mine with you today. So what I aim to do is to share both a personal and professional journey. I've identified here that I'm speaking particularly to you today, in case you haven't noticed, as a black woman and as an academic, but working within the arena of health. And this straddling of different parts of my identity and my experience is the real world to me every day, whether I'm at work or whether I'm at home. And for many of you it will be the same. You know, you may have different identities that define you, but many people do this straddling. So I'm not claiming anything that's different or difficult to what you all know, but I'm just helping you to see a little glimpse of how I've got to where I've got to and what has influenced me. Now this is a clue for you now. These are a selection of the giants that I will be introducing you to today during this presentation. Now I don't expect you to remember all their names, and to help you as we go through the presentation, their names are in blue. Okay. Now these are my giants. I'm not saying these are the giants, these are mine. And I would invite any of you who look down this and haven't recognised any of them. Many of them you'll probably know a little bit about, and those you don't, if you've got nothing else to do, I would look a few of them up, because they have very interesting things to say. So these are the giants that we'll talk about today. The first I'm going to start with, which you won't find on any index or reference libraries, I have to say, are my parents. My parents came to England from Dominica in the Caribbean. Not the Republic, I have to say that every time, but the island, the Commonwealth. And Dominica is not typical of Caribbean islands. It's not typical because it's a very small island. It has a total population of about 70,000 people. It's 30 miles long, and contrary to people's expectations of the Caribbean, the beaches are black. We have no golden sands, we don't have any of that. You know, we also don't have any sandals resorts, hooray. So, what you find in Dominica is, and I've given you a picture here from last time I was there on holiday, the beaches are black sand, it's a very green island, it's actually known as the nature island of the Caribbean, and it's rainforest, most of it. And my parents left there and went to what is known as the Green North. So I think that was definitely a challenge on many occasions. But they were the first giants for me, not simply because they were my parents, but because what they instilled in me through their actions was a sense of adventure, a sense of taking a risk, a sense of going somewhere where other people had not been, and a sense of being inquisitive. So what I gained from them, I believe, is the starting of interest in research and asking the why question. And that was the start for me. So they are the first giants that I introduce you to. Now, becoming a researcher was something that kind of happened to me. It wasn't a career plan I had in, it just happened. And I started, when I put in this presentation together, to think about what is it about research that links with my personal life and the first giants I've introduced you to, that inquisitive, asking nature. And one of the things that struck me about research is that it's a cyclical activity. It's something that we do over and over again. And that research is never completed. The job is never done. What we do in research is we visit and we revisit the past constantly. And we revisit our assumptions and our understandings of the past constantly. And we either do that to reinforce that yes, we're still on the right track, yes, that is still right, or to challenge and go, you know what, I don't think that's quite right anymore. Because what we realise in research, and what we realise as researchers, is that time and context changes not only our experience, but how we understand our experiences. So we test out and review our thinking, whether that's on an academic stance in a professional sense, or in a personal stance and a personal platform. What it reminds me of is the readings of George Santana. If any of you have not read those. He was a philosopher, and he has a particular phrase which always resounds with me when I think about research, and that is, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the key word there for me is condemned. Because at the point at which we stand still, and the point at which we think we know it all, whether that's personally or professionally, we are condemned. We're condemned to be confined within our own experience, and condemned to be confined within our own thinking. And for me, the inquisitive, risk-taking child that I was brought up to be, I cannot be confined or condemned in that way. That's both a blessing and a curse, to say. Now, my area of research is, I tend to do all my research, certainly at the beginning, within issues around disparities, inequalities, diversity. Trying to seek out the voices that aren't usually heard. And research itself is always challenging anyway, because of this revisiting and visiting, this check-in and rechecking. But if, as a researcher, you put on top of that subjects which make people uncomfortable, or subjects which are not popular, whether that's for funders or whether that's for even your peers, and certainly subjects that may not necessarily be popular with your employer because you've got a chance to become a Daily Mail headline. Okay. So if you take race and ethnicity, which is my area, they always remain difficult things to research, because it can never just be a purely academic exercise. And certainly for a black female researching race and ethnicity, it can never be a totally non-personal exercise. So they're difficult things to straddle. And when we intersect race and ethnicity with social constraints around gender, around economy, around education, around rights and responsibilities, they are bigger impacts then, not just on health, but on life chances. The thing that drives me around my research in this area is a willingness and a need to find an equal chance. To give people an equal chance, because that's all you can do. You have no power about whether they take up those chances, about whether they agree with their chances, but the driver is around an equal chance. And that's difficult. So the context in which I do my work is both professional and personal. It's challenging because of the nature of research itself, but it's further complicated by the subjects in which the challenge happens. And what have I learned from that so far? What I've learned as an academic, and as a black female academic particularly, is that research requires me to develop both the science and the art of doing it. It requires the factual information, whether that's qualitative or quantitative in the way I gather it, and it requires an artistic approach to delivering a message so that it can be heard. And that means taking account of the difficulties of the context and the difficulties of the subject and the arenas in which it may be misused as well as used. This is a very well-known phrase, and this is the phrase that sums up what I call the science and the art for me of my work. The personal is political. And that's where the second giant comes in. Marilyn French. I read The Women's Room when I was 9 years old. I know it seems a weird thing. I'm not saying I understood it at 9 years old, but I read it at 9 years old because the inquisitive person I was at the time, and certainly as a child, the way in which my mother kept me quiet, and the way in which she answered questions or got me to find the answers to questions that she didn't know was by me going to the library. And I joined the library at the age of 5, and by the time I was 8, 9 years old, I was reading 6 books a week, because that was the maximum they'd let you take out. And I literally worked my way through the shelves of the children's books, and then I started reading other books, which is why I ended up with Women's Room at the age of 9. And the one thing that struck me in that book was the personal is political. Even though I didn't quite understand it, I liked the way it sounded. Years and years later, more than 9 years later, I was captured by another giant, who will appear later, but I'm going to tell you who, and that is Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde was a black lesbian poet and activist. And Audre Lorde talked about silence, and when I read her work, what I heard was the importance of the silent voices, the importance that what happens to us as individuals is the point. And that it was at that point that I actually understood what the personal is political meant. It struck me then that that was the point. The things that happened to the women in the women's room was the point. That instead of seeing it as individual, isolated or isolating events, they were small examples of greater things happening on a social scale, on a political scale, and in relation to the power that existed within society. And Audre Lorde's focus here, and the phrase when I read her speeches, she talks about the fact that the importance of breaking silence. And for me, that's the importance of hearing and telling personal stories that are the point. So the phrase here, it is not history that immobilizes us from action. So it's not because what's happened in the past that we don't do anything now, or because we've tried it before, but it's the silence. And whenever we accept silence, we accept the past, and as Santana said, we are condemned to repeat it. So therefore, I felt that in order to give you some sense of my silences, I had to tell you a little bit about the experiences for me that are the point. The experiences that have driven me to do the work that I've done, and I suppose initiated me beyond that curious child to become an academic, to become a healthcare professional, and to become someone who stands and tells the story. So what were my challenges in my time? And I've chosen 2 to share with you. The first one is my training as a nurse. I trained as a nurse in 1982, and I went to Sheffield City Polytechnic, and I did one of the first degrees in nursing. And for those of you who are very good at maths, you'll calculate that's over 30 years ago. Which means that when I stand and hear people talk about it'll all go to the dogs because we've gone to all degree nursing, as if it was just invented, that's the point. It hasn't, and it won't. But the point here for me really, in terms of my nurse training, is when I trained as a nurse, I was the only black student in the whole cohort. And we did do quite a lot of work at the time up in Sheffield. It was and still is a very diverse city. And we did a lot of talking around transcultural nursing, as we called it then, and I know many people still call it that now. But in every example that we used, the patient was black and the nurse was white. And all the lectures talked about how to cope in a transcultural situation, completely blind to the fact that every situation practically I worked in was a transcultural situation. And I found myself sitting in those lectures thinking, this is really great, but it's not really about me. We also did clinical skills. We learned about how to observe the human body and how to notice signs of health and ill health. We learned about the signs of shock. We learned how people in shock went very pale. We learned how the blood drained from their faces and they looked very white. And I thought, they're not talking about me. I actually left the lecture thinking, well, obviously black people don't have strokes or have shock. And that is the point. The point is that actually, by silencing my experience, at the very best, it was an oversight. At the very worst, it could be life-threatening. Because I don't want myself or any of my family or my friends to be in a situation where they are in collapse and then suddenly we think, actually, I don't think I've ever been taught what a black person looks like when they're in shock. That's not the time. And that's the point. I also, in my experience then, had placements that I went to where patients or their families said, I do not want that black nurse to touch me. And instead of the nurses or the staff nurse or the sisters who are in charge addressing the patient, they said to me, never mind, just go to another patient. The personal is political. That is the point. So the challenges around that, and for me, what I get from Audre Lorde's words is it's important for people to hear those words. Because these are not just stories of 1982. There are students having that experience now. And that needs to be heard and addressed. So very much in the nurse training, what I've described to you is something that I started calling insider out. So in one sense, I was inside because I was doing nurse training, I was a nurse, but in another sense, both in the classroom and in placement, I was an outsider because the rules did not apply to me. The rules I was being taught did not apply. So my challenge, for example, to you, if you're in a teaching capacity is, how prepared is your teaching to support the students to manage the diversity of the communities and the societies in which they're going to work? And how prepared are they to manage their own diversity as part of that community going out? The three giants I have here are those that struck me during my training as a nurse. Felicity Stockwell, Edith Cavell, and Mary Seacole. And all for different reasons. My favourite out of those, in case you ever wanted, I actually met a few years ago. And boy, did I have, that, despite my what you perceive to be, a mature academic position, I kind of all went, oh, I can't believe I met her. And that's Felicity Stockwell. And the reason I like Felicity Stockwell, those of you who've never read her paper, she was written in the 70s. Some of you weren't even thought of in the 70s, okay? It was a paper called The Unpopular Patient. And the reason I loved that paper was because it was the first time I'd ever read a paper that said, sometimes as nurses, we don't like our patients. And sometimes we find subtle ways to punish them. And for me, on those wards, when patients didn't want me to touch them, I didn't like them. And I would have loved to be able to think of a way to punish them, if I'm honest. But it wasn't about physically punishing them, it was about a sense of being silenced in a situation. So I would suggest you look at that if you haven't done so. The second thing, during my nursing experience, which struck me, and which affected the challenges I had, was the nature of the subjects I was interested in. So way back in the day, for those of you who don't know, after you trained as a nurse, before you could specialise, you had to do 6 months medicine and 6 months surgery. I'm trying not to look at anyone who's nodding their head because that shows they're at least as old as me. You had to do 6 months medicine in a hospital and 6 months surgery, and then you could specialise. And I had always wanted to be a midwife. So I did my 6 month medicine, I did my 6 month surgery, and then I went on to work on a gynecological ward in order to wait for a place to come in midwifery. And in 1986, what happened when I'd started working on this gynae board was AIDS came with a vengeance. And what happened then is I started to observe that not we'd gone beyond not liking some of our patients, but some people were ostracised by nature of being associated with a disease that caused a pandemic of fear. And so a job was advertised to be a community outreach nurse working around HIV and AIDS specifically, and I applied for it. And I was the only applicant because nobody wanted to work with people who had AIDS. And notice I say AIDS because we didn't even have HIV at that point. We had AIDS. And what I learned then is that as nursing within that arena also tarred me with the same brush, and I use the word specifically, as the people that I worked with. And this was a time of fear. This was a time when working within HIV and AIDS, or being associated with one of the groups, one of them being obviously people from Africa, despite the fact that I was not from Africa, people crossed the road when they saw you coming. People were so afraid that they took their own knives and forks and plates and cups when they went for a meal. That was the level of hysteria we had. And the first survey that was supposed to be run around that time around sexual health or sexual practices in the UK, which was the general survey, was stopped. We had headlines like, we shouldn't be spending money researching HIV and AIDS, well, researching AIDS at the time, because these people should be dying in a cesspool of their own making. That was where we were in 1982. And that to me struck me as once again we're in a scenario where certain people are silenced and that there is a power struggle which says what is worthy and what is not worthy. What should be centralised and what should be marginalised. And so I took that job and I worked as an outreach worker and a nurse around HIV and AIDS and sexual health, focusing specifically on developing and supporting people from black and minority ethnic communities and developing and supporting people from lesbian and gay communities, because we hadn't gone to LGBT as we have now. And that was where I worked. I never became a midwife, in case you're wondering. I became a nurse in sexual health and HIV and AIDS, and I worked in the community. But even within my profession of nursing, I was not allowed to join the community nursing register. And the reason was because you could only join the community nursing register if you were a district nurse or a midwife, a health visitor at that point. And I was neither. So, and I never joined it. So despite the fact that all my clinical practice has been in the community, I'm still registered on the adult part of the register. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, you could do now. I could do, but why? I really don't want to. And that's my choice. So this was very much about not just a subject, but about the importance of people being heard. And once again, it demonstrates that what's important here in research and in work is not just the science and the detail, but the art, the conversation, the discussion, and the human aspect of health and well-being. And that brings me to the next group of giants. The women's work that I read that reflected this need and this importance of people being able to speak for themselves. Rosa Parks, Madam Walker, Harriet Tubman and Mary Angelou. These women championed the art of telling their own stories rather than having their voices taken from them and used on their behalf. And that started me thinking that while my work so far had been about working with marginalised groups and with groups that didn't have much centre stage, shall we say, that I started to move towards trying to find ways to speak my own truth, but help people to find their own voices, and speak for themselves. I can't sum it up any better than the next giant, Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer, you may not have heard of, but I'm sure you've heard of her phrase. Fannie Lou Hamer was a civil rights activist, and she was also someone born with a mild learning disability and also had some physical disabilities and illness all her life. She was attacked and beaten and raped on many occasions when she was arrested as part of the civil rights movement. And yet this woman stood and spoke eloquently and talked about the need to make a change. And her phrase, sick and tired of being sick and tired, is from her speech, which I've put here if anybody wants to read it. And Fannie Lou Hamer talked about the need to continue and to strive on if you really believe something, and the need to talk about what happens to you, and the need to actually make a difference rather than just speak for the sake of speaking. And she constantly said, all my life I've been sick and I've been tired, and now I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that's where I had reached in terms of working to make a difference. And what I realised was, it wasn't enough for me just to do my job well where I was. I had to actually try and strive and make sure that at least the information about people's experiences were there. So at least there wasn't the excuse that, well, we don't know anything about it, so we can't make any changes. And that's what led me towards researching this particular arena. As this is all about International Women's Day coming, I thought, well, actually, it will be useful to give you some information about the voices, about the experiences of black women particularly, and about how that impacts on health and well-being. And I introduce you to the next giant, Bell Hooks. She wrote a book called Ain't I a Woman? And she actually challenged the feminist movement, who at the time talked about all women as if they were all the same. And what was missing within the feminist dialogue at the time was the voices of black women, women with disabilities, minority women in general. And her book's called Ain't I a Woman? And what that challenged me to think about, and I was thinking about today, is, okay then, this is the question I posed in my head. I looked at how black women's health always seems to be worse when you look at women in general. And so the question for me is, why is that? Why is it at the time now where we have more information about risk, we know more about personal care and social opportunity, why are black and minority ethnic women still falling behind in measures of well-being when they are in the same context as their peers? So we're not comparing England to Sudan or Africa, we're talking within the same arena. So I thought I'd share some of those silences with you and some of the information. The other question, before I show you the examples, comes around black women in education. If you look at what happens within education, black women compared to men actually are doing relatively well. But despite the fact that we are improving in terms of our education ability, in our marketplace and business in general, we're still losing the battle of our health. And in thinking about the previous question and thinking about this, I've had many, many discussions with two of my other giants that I show you here, Elizabeth Anyonwu, Professor, and Neslin Drury Watson Drury. We talk about, so what's gone wrong? Why is this happening? And has anybody noticed? So here are the things to notice. Right back in 2007, Nancy Seidemann talked about black women's health on MSBC, and you can go and see, you can still go now and look at the transcripts of the programs she had. And she talked about black women in the US, and the fact that they have an increased risk of mortality more than any other ethnic group for almost every major cause of disease and death. What that reminded me of, going back to my cyclical thing, was when I started working around HIV and AIDS, in many states of the US, the #1 killer of black women was HIV and AIDS. And when you think in everything, more than heart disease, more than anything else, how can that be? It can't just be a clinical question of disease transmission. it must also intersect into a social, a personal, and a cultural question about the pressures of living a particular life, the challenges that people have to meet in the everyday. Those things must make a difference to this. So let's have a look. In the USA, minority women continue to lag about 5 years behind in life expectancy compared to their peers in the same groups. About 1 black woman in 4 over the age 55 has diabetes. And the levels of diabetes within black communities are higher among black, Hispanic, around African American, Indian and Asian Pacific women, higher than white women, in the same social context, remember. High blood pressure, lupus, HIV and AIDS still disproportionately affect black women. These are not only diseases of black women, they're disproportionately affected. And has anybody noticed? Let's look at the UK. Among black Caribbean women, diabetes is relatively high compared to the general population. It's roughly around 8% and rising, compared to a general rate of 3% in the same context. If you look at young black women, they're more likely to have, those diagnosed with breast cancer are more likely to have aggressive cancers with poorer prognosis, despite the same access to treatment. And from a social and cultural perspective, for those of you who don't know, fat, P-H-A-T, means pretty hot and thick, which is a good thing when you're a black woman, so we're told. So we're revered as being fat women, P-H-A-T. However, at the same time, we're combating the fat, F-A-T, that's challenging our lives. So what does that say in terms of the artistic message? These things are important. They go back to the personal message that is the political point. They're also the research point, and the question point, and the challenge point. And the giants we have here are people who, in reading their work, lead me to question and think about, well, so what's the point, and has anybody noticed? Scaife and Dadsey wrote a seminal work about black women's lives in Britain. And that was written way back in the early 70s, and it was redone again in the 80s. And Stella Dadsey has written lots and lots around this. So these people are people who talk about the importance of being heard and doing something about it. Some are poets, some are writers of prose, and some are researchers. But they're all giants for me in terms of triggering my thinking about the importance of being heard. And they started for me to think about, how do I help the hearing? And as a researcher, how can I help other people to research so they can hear? I developed, in part of my doctorate, a concept called screaming silencers. And screaming silencers is a concept that denotes areas of research that are either under-researched or undervalued or seldom heard. In everyday language, it often reflects those things that we know to be true from our experience, but which aren't in the books. And again, that goes back to my experiences from when I was training. So things that they said, I said, well, I know that's not true, that doesn't happen in my house. Okay. And in talking and listening to women, in this particular sense, these are women talking about sexual and reproductive health, which is my subject area of work, and black women talking about the menopause and the impact on their lives. And what we hear from them, or what I heard from them, are 2 quotes here, that in hearing our voices, what we hear is the challenge that people live with every day. What we hear is the personal struggle they have, and what we hear is what it's safe for them to say or not say at a particular point in time, and what's expected of them from society, from their families, and from themselves. So I've got 2 quotes here. One, the women talking about, we're always expected to be strong women. She's talking about, as black women, why people don't know the answers and why they may not tell their stories, who are not supposed to whine about anything. Another says you just take life as it comes and do what you have to do. If you're having troubles or problems, you should just pray about it and keep going. I don't think my culture believes that menopausal symptoms are something that you would run to the doctor. And these are sometimes the context, some of the things that we hear that might help us to understand why do people not access this wonderful service that we do? Why do people not take up these wonderful opportunities? If we don't hear their voices, we cannot always answer those questions from the outside. These phrases are really from my experience, my story and voices. What I didn't say at the outset was that originally I'd always wanted to be a doctor. I even applied to medical school. I was even offered a place. But when I went to the open day, in the nicest possible way to any medical doctors here, I went in there and I remember an experience sitting outside the room where we'd already been offered the places. This was way back for those of you who were students in the day where you didn't always have to have an interview and run through a hula hoop before you got offered a place, and it was actually free. And we went to an open day to kind of find out a bit more what kind of speciality we would go to. Now, sitting outside the room with 3 other students and 2 second-year medical students who'd been getting on my nerves all day, 2 second-year medical students, and one of the medical students said to me, "Oh, which school did you go to?" And I said, "I went to Trinity Comprehensive." And they all, including the other 2 interviewing me, looked at me and went, "You went to a comprehensive?" "Yes." "You've done well, haven't you?" "Yes." And then I walked into the room, and the first question was asked me was, "What does your father do?" And I said, "He drives a forklift truck." And they went, "You've done well, haven't you?" And at that point, I decided I wasn't going to go. And I stood up and I said, "I think I'm in the wrong room." And they shuffled their papers, and they said, no, "You're on our list." I said, "No, I think I'm in the wrong room." And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I'm not going to do this. I think I'm going to be a nurse." And I got up and I walked out. And when I got to the door, they called me back, and they said, "Just remember, when you leave this room, you could have been a doctor." So that reminded me, and I don't regret it. It was the right choice for me. Years later, I got my PhD, so I am a doctor. And it's not an honorary title. So I always remember that for myself, you could have been a doctor. So although I haven't got the name of a giant there, I think that person did me a real good favour. Because I walked out and I went, and I'm going to be a doctor, but not here and not with you. And that's what led me. Without that, I would not have had the other experiences and led myself down to doing what I'm doing. So since then, that led me to do PhD studies, and very much my journey has been about seeking myself and understanding what drives me and what's important, and more importantly, enabling others to speak, whether that's professionally or personally, and leading to the development of the concept that I said, screaming silencers, that I did during my PhD. Postdoctorally, I've developed that into a research framework for conducting research around marginalised groups or silent issues, called the Silencers Framework, which is published. And none of that would have happened, I don't believe, if I'd taken up and done the medical doctor thing. There's a well-known phrase by Jan Fischer-Kahn, a philosopher, that says, "The candle is not there to illuminate itself." And I think this brings me towards my work now, where actually seeking myself, which is where I started, and enabling others to speak, which is what my journey that I've been on, is really about this. That I don't believe that my role as an academic, my role as a healthcare professional, or my role as a black woman doing those things is about my own development. Because even by standing and being there, it creates a different dialogue. And my role, and the thing that I think is important in professional development, is not just about yourself, but about what you illuminate for others in your presence. And the giants I have here are people who I believe, through their actions and their work, have illuminated the room or where they have been for other people. That doesn't mean they haven't progressed, it means they've illuminated for a different reason. And here in the picture you see my very good friend who's won the Jack Bottom, Professor Udi Archibong from Bradford. And this is where we've got the HSJ Women's Award. I don't know who nominated me, I still don't know to this day. But these people all believe that their work is about illuminating the better for a different purpose. Their work is about putting the personal and political in action. For those of you who don't know Audrey Emerson, she is the only nurse crossbencher in the House of Lords. She also knew Felicity Stockwell, introduced me to us, so that was lovely. But she was a real champion of nursing and health in the face of medical opposition often. And she's a real champion in the House of Lords, in the face of everybody, I think. Anyway, so these are people who push forward and live that truth. For me, I think the important thing is the science and art of what we do, both things. So here I am, 30 years and counting. And how I would sum up for you what I believe is this, is that how we learn and how we experience and respond to health issues, both personally and professionally, is the point. And it shapes not only our workforce, but ultimately the communities in which we live, whose voices are heard, whether they are heard, and whether anybody has noticed. That's the point for me. I'm going to close by leaving you with the words of one other woman I admire. Clara Barton was the founder of the American Red Cross. She wrote many books, and this quote is from one of her third book. And she talks about the importance of just striving forward. And she said, "I have an almost complete disregard of precedent and a faith in the possibility of something better. It irritates me to be told how things have always been done. I defy the tyranny of precedent. I go for anything new that might improve the past. I cannot afford the luxury of a closed mind." So in closing, what I would say to you, heed the words of Clara and dare to be different. Take the opportunity to challenge yourself. Take the opportunity to ask those questions that people may not want you to ask, but always be prepared to change your view in the presence of new information and new evidence. Because that's what it's about, cyclical revisiting, visiting and changing, personally and professionally. Because whatever you do, in whichever profession you're in, one of the benefits of the 21st century is you have much more time to set your own future and much more time to impact on what happens for others who cannot speak for themselves.